April 9th, 1241. Picture this: the most elite fighting force Europe has ever assembled. We're talking about 100,000 of the finest knights, warriors, and soldiers from across the continent, completely and utterly annihilated in just 72 hours by an army they literally laughed at when they first saw them. I'm not talking about a close battle here. I'm talking about a massacre so complete, so devastating that European mothers would tell their children stories about it for the next 400 years. And the craziest part? The force that did this to them was smaller, had worse armor, and rode horses that looked like ponies. This is the story of how 20,000 Mongol warriors changed the course of world history in 3 days. And trust me, what happened at the Battle of Legnica is going to blow your mind. But before we dive into this absolute bloodbath, let me set the scene for you, because this isn't just some random medieval skirmish. This is the moment when two completely different worlds collided head-on, and spoiler alert, only one of them survived. On one side, you've got European chivalry in all its glory. We're talking about knights who literally spent their entire lives training for war, wearing armor that cost more than most people made in a decade, riding massive war horses that could crush a man just by stepping on him. These weren't just soldiers. They were the absolute peak of medieval military technology, backed by the full power of the Catholic Church and convinced that God himself was on their side. Some of these guys had been on crusades, fought in the Holy Land, and never lost a single battle. They genuinely believed they were invincible. And then you have the Mongols. Now here's where it gets interesting, because when these European knights first laid eyes on the Mongol army, they literally started laughing. Picture this. Why? Are expecting to face some terrifying barbarian horde. And instead, you see these relatively small men riding what looked like ponies compared to your massive war horses. Their armor looked primitive, their weapons seemed basic, and honestly, they just didn't look that scary. What these Europeans didn't realize was that they were staring at the heirs of Genghis Khan's military machine, a force that had conquered everything from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe in just 2 generations. Every single one of these Mongol warriors could ride before they could walk, shoot a bow at full gallop with deadly accuracy, and survive for weeks on nothing but mare's milk and dried meat. They had just finished tearing through China, crushing Islamic kingdoms, and making the Great Wall of China look like a minor inconvenience. The man leading this European army was Duke Henry II, known as Henry the Pious, and honestly, he was everything you'd want in a medieval commander. He was deeply religious, genuinely cared about his people, and had been getting increasingly desperate messages from the East about some kind of supernatural force that was systematically destroying everything in its path. The reports were so insane that most people didn't believe them at first. Cities being burned to the ground in days, massive armies disappearing without a trace, and everywhere these Mongols went, they left nothing but death and destruction. Henry knew he had to act fast, because the Mongols had already burned Lublin, sacked Sandomierz, and left Krakow in complete ruins. So Henry did what any good Christian ruler would do. He called for help, and the response was incredible. Knights came pouring in from across Poland, Moravia, and the German states. We're talking about the absolute elite here: Knights Templar, Teutonic Knights, the finest Polish nobility, and even gold miners volunteering to defend Christendom. The chronicles claim this army numbered 100,000 men, and while that's probably an exaggeration born from fear and hope, even conservative estimates put it somewhere between 25 and 40,000 soldiers. To put that in perspective, William the Conqueror invaded England with about 10,000 men, and the Third Crusade barely exceeded 30,000. This was a massive force by medieval standards. But here's what makes this story even more insane. The Mongols knew exactly what they were up against. See, while the Europeans were busy praying and polishing their armor, the Mongols had been studying them for months. They had spies disguised as merchants throughout Europe, gathering intelligence on everything from European battle tactics to the personal habits of individual commanders. The Mongol generals, Baidar and Kadan, both grandsons of Genghis Khan himself, knew that European knights were slow, their horses tired quickly, and most importantly, they fought for personal glory rather than coordinated victory. The Mongols had a simple philosophy: kill your enemy before they can reach you. The Europeans believed in glorious close combat, where individual heroism could turn the tide of battle. April 7th, 1241, Day 1. The European army marched out from Legnica in traditional formation, and honestly, it must have been an incredible sight. Picture thousands of knights in gleaming armor, lances held high, banners flying, with hymns being sung and priests giving blessings. Each knight's armor represented a file or tune. We're talking about the cost of an entire village's yearly production just for one man's equipment. Behind them came Polish spearmen, Moravian crossbowmen, and those Silesian miners who had volunteered to fight. This was European military might at its absolute peak. And then they saw the Mongols for the first time, and like I said, they literally started laughing. These small men on small horses just didn't look threatening. But that laughter died pretty quickly when the arrows started flying. See, Mongol composite bows were accurate at 350 meters, while European crossbows had maybe half that range. So while the European army was still trying to get close enough to fight, they were getting turned into pincushions from a distance they couldn't even respond to. And we're not talking about a few arrows here and there. Do the math. 20,000 Mongols, each carrying about 60 arrows, firing in coordinated volleys. That's over 1 million projectiles raining down on the European army. The Europeans had trained their entire lives for glorious cavalry charges and heroic single combat. Instead, they found themselves standing there like targets, while horses screamed and arrows found every gap in their armor. Their crossbows were too slow to reload, their cavalry charges couldn't reach the enemy, and every time they tried to advance, the Mongols would simply ride away and keep shooting. By the end of the first day, hundreds of Europeans were dead or wounded, while the Mongols had lost maybe a dozen men. And just to add insult to injury, the Mongols kept their war drums going all night, making sure the Europeans couldn't get any sleep. Day 2, April 8th. The Europeans woke up to a blood-red dawn, which honestly should have been a warning sign. The army was exhausted, morale was cracking, and the commanders were starting to argue. The Teutonic Knights were demanding a full cavalry charge to end this humiliation, while Duke Mieszko was threatening to withdraw his forces entirely. Henry was caught in the middle, trying to hold together an increasingly fractured coalition. Finally, he made the decision that would doom half his army. He ordered a partial cavalry charge under Duke Mieszko's command. 2,000 of Poland's finest knights thundered forward, and at first, it looked like it might actually work. The Mongol light cavalry seemed to panic and flee, with the Polish knights in hot pursuit. For miles, they chased what looked like a completely routed enemy, and the Europeans back at the main army started cheering. They thought they had finally broken the Mongol army, and that victory was at hand. What they didn't realize was that they had just fallen for the oldest trick in the Mongol playbook, the feigned retreat. See, this wasn't panic. This was a carefully orchestrated trap that the Mongols had perfected over decades of warfare. They had drawn the Polish cavalry miles away from the main army, strung them out in a long, broken formation, and gotten their horses completely exhausted from the extended chase. And then, when the Polish knights were at their most vulnerable, Mongol heavy cavalry emerged from hidden positions on all sides, while the light cavalry that had been fleeing suddenly wheeled around and closed the trap. What happened next wasn't a battle. It was an organized slaughter. The Mongols circled the trapped Polish knights like wolves, pouring arrows into them from all directions, then charging in coordinated waves to finish off anyone still standing. Duke Mieszko himself fought like a demon, personally killing a dozen Mongols before 5 arrows finally brought him down. Of the 2,000 knights who had ridden out that morning, fewer than 200 made it back, and just to send a message, the Mongols preserved Duke Mieszko's head and sent it back to the European camp with a simple note: "Tomorrow, you." Some of the survivors came back completely broken, claiming that the Mongols fought with supernatural coordination, that they moved like they shared a single mind. "They are not men," became the dying words repeated by multiple witnesses. The psychological impact was devastating. Here was proof that European military superiority was a myth, that their finest warriors could be systematically destroyed by an enemy they had been taught to consider inferior. Day 3, April 9th, 1241. This was it. The final showdown that would determine whether Europe survived or fell to the Mongol war machine. The European War Council was barely keeping panic under control. They had lost a quarter of their army in a single engagement. The Moravians were talking about leaving, and Polish nobles were literally fleeing in the night. Retreating wasn't an option because the Mongols would run them down like animals. They had to make their stand here, on the field outside Legnica, and pray that God would intervene. Henry chose the battlefield carefully, a slight rise with a stream on one side to prevent complete encirclement. He positioned the Knights Templar and Teutonic Knights in the center, the remaining Polish forces on the right wing, and the infantry on the left, while he commanded the reserve. These were the most elite military orders in Christendom, men who had taken vows of poverty and chastity, but had devoted their lives to war in service of God. If anyone could stand against the Mongol onslaught, it would be them. But the Mongols had one more surprise, and this one was going to change warfare forever. The Europeans noticed strange devices being wheeled into position, large pots and cauldrons that nobody could identify. What they were looking at was Chinese military technology, gunpowder weapons that the Mongols had acquired during their conquest of the Jin dynasty. As the battle began, these devices started producing massive clouds of thick, choking smoke that rolled across the entire battlefield like a supernatural fog. Within minutes, the European formation completely collapsed into chaos. Men couldn't see their own feet, commanders couldn't be heard shouting orders, and banners disappeared into the smoke. Horses panicked and threw their riders, units lost contact with each other, and what had been a disciplined army became a collection of confused, isolated groups stumbling around blind. This was chemical warfare, 600 years before World War I, and the Europeans had absolutely no idea how to respond to it. But here's where the Mongols pulled off their masterstroke of psychological warfare. They had captured European prisoners over the previous days and forced them to learn a specific Polish phrase, uciekajcie, wszystko stracone, which means, run, all is lost. As the smoke thickened and chaos spread, Mongol warriors who could speak Polish began shouting retreat orders in perfect Polish accents. European soldiers, hearing what they thought were their own commanders ordering a retreat, began streaming away from the battle. The left wing broke first, leaving the center completely exposed. How the Mongols maintained their coordination in smoke so thick you couldn't see your own hands remains one of the great military mysteries of history. Some historians think they used sound signals. Others believe it was simply superior training and discipline. But somehow, despite conditions that had reduced the Europeans to stumbling chaos, the Mongols attacked in perfect formation from multiple directions simultaneously. The Knights Templar and Teutonic Knights, true to their oaths, refused to retreat and fought to the last man. Their Grandmaster, Popo von Osterna, was found after the battle with 23 arrows in his body, his sword broken from overuse, surrounded by a pile of Mongol dead. These men had earned their martyrdom, but martyrdom doesn't win battles. The Teutonic Knights managed to form a wedge formation and actually broke through the Mongol lines, but they were run down and slaughtered during the pursuit. Duke Henry himself made one last desperate attempt to rally his forces, raising his personal banner to create a rallying point for any survivors. But the Mongols had marked him as the enemy commander, and arrows began flying toward his position from every direction. One arrow found the joint where his armor plates met at the armpit, the kind of precision shot that required incredible skill and luck. As Henry fell from his horse, his bodyguards formed a circle around him, dying one by one as they tried to protect their wounded duke. Henry refused the quick death his men begged him to take, choosing instead to die as a Christian knight should. When the battle was over and the looting began, his mother had to identify his body by the 6 toes on his left foot, a condition called polydactyly that ran in his family. The Mongols cut off his head, placed it on a spear, and paraded it around the city of Legnica as proof of their complete victory. The aftermath was beyond horrific. The Mongols had a custom of cutting the right ear off every enemy they killed to get an accurate count of the dead, and after Legnica, they filled 9 large leather sacks with ears. Conservative estimates put European casualties at between 10 and 20. 5,000 dead, with virtually the entire Silesian nobility wiped out. The Knights Templar and Teutonic Knights lost an entire generation of their brothers. Centuries-old ruling families were extinguished in a single morning. Mongol casualties? Less than 700, mostly from those final heavy cavalry charges when the Europeans briefly managed to close to melee range. The battlefield itself was so covered with bodies that witnesses claimed you could walk for hundreds of yards without ever touching the ground. Carrion birds blocked out the sun. The stench could be smelled for miles, and peasants were still finding bones in their fields decades later. A Mongol force of 20,000 had completely annihilated the largest European army assembled up to that point, and they had done it in just 3 days. The psychological impact across Europe was immediate and devastating. News of the disaster spread like wildfire, reaching Paris within weeks. King Louis VII began strengthening city walls and training his army in new tactics. Pope Gregory X called for a crusade to defend Europe from what he called the Devil's Horsemen. Even Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II and the Pope, who had been at each other's throats for years, started discussing peace negotiations in the face of this external threat. Medieval chroniclers struggled to comprehend what had happened. One wrote, "The Mongols are the punishment of God, for they fight as demons, not as men." The entire foundation of European military doctrine, the supremacy of the mounted knight, had been proven obsolete in a single engagement. Honor-based combat meant nothing against an enemy focused solely on winning. The feudal system itself, which was built around the military superiority of heavily armored cavalry, suddenly looked fragile and outdated. But here's the crazy twist that saved Europe. In December 1241, just months after Legnica, Ögedei Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire, died suddenly. Some say it was from heavy drinking, others suspect poison, but regardless of the cause, Mongol law required all members of the royal family to return to Mongolia to elect a new Khan. Batu Khan, frustrated but obedient to tradition, abandoned his European campaign and headed east. The Mongols would never penetrate this far into Europe again, as political struggles, vast distances, and the gradual fragmentation of their empire shifted their focus elsewhere. The Battle of Legnica had forced a complete revolution in European military thinking within a single generation. Armies began adopting integrated tactics, combining infantry, cavalry, and archery. Early experiments with gunpowder weapons accelerated. The age of the individual knight supremacy was ending, gradually replaced by disciplined professional armies that valued coordination over personal valor. Some historians argue that Legnica actually saved Europe by teaching these harsh lessons early, preparing the continent for later threats like the Ottoman Empire. When the Ottomans, inheriting many Mongol military traditions, began their expansion into Europe 2 centuries later, they faced a completely different opponent, one that had learned the value of combined arms, gunpowder weapons, and professional discipline. The 3 days at Legnica had transformed European warfare forever. Today, the battlefield is peaceful farmland, with only a small monument marking where one of history's most decisive battles took place. Every April 9th, historical reenactors gather to commemorate the event, though their carefully choreographed displays can barely capture the chaos and terror of those 3 days in 1241. For the Poles, Legnica represents both a national tragedy and a source of pride. Their ancestors stood against an unstoppable force, and, though they died with honor. For military historians, it remains the perfect example of how superior tactics and discipline can overcome advantages in numbers and technology. But perhaps the most important lesson of Legnica is simpler and more universal. No empire, no matter how powerful or advanced, is immune to sudden, catastrophic change. In just 72 hours, the Mongols shattered European assumptions about their own invincibility and forced an entire continent to evolve or die. Those 3 days didn't just change military history, they changed the world.
Charge! For the Khan!